Over the past few weeks, we have been looking at mythology, particularly Greek mythology, as it has been shown in Homer's The Iliad. But now, what we're going to look at is we're going to look at how mythology has actually inspired artworks throughout centuries. And this doesn't just mean Greek and Roman mythology, which is what I'm going to focus on, but any sort of mythology, whether it's Norse, Celtic, Egyptian. And this has been a subject matter that has been a favorite of artists throughout time. We're just going to look at a little sampling of it in this lecture, but this is going to play into the assignment that you're going to do this week, whether it is a discussion board or for some classes it's an assigned essay. But what you're going to do is you're going to go out and find your own artwork that has been somehow inspired by mythology, and then you're going to discuss it, talk about how it stays true to the original myth or if it's more of an adaptation, meaning how has the creator looked at the original myth and have they reinterpreted it, what changes have they made. An example of this would be the movie Troy. The movie Troy is a modern day film adaptation based off of Homer's The Iliad. And there's definitely a lot of changes in this. Why? Because you're going to take the 500-page epic poem and you have to translate it into a film that's going to be about an hour and a half long. On this one, you may not use Troy as an example of your work. But let's look at mythology in art. Now, first we're going to start with classical mythology, and we're going to look at ancient Greece. Now, we're looking at the Parthenon in Athens. This was the original temple created for Athena. When it was created, this wasn't mythology at the time. Remember, the Greeks were pagans that believed in many gods. So what happens with the Parthenon? Construction began in 447 BCE, and it opened in 438 BCE. Here we see the very classic Greek architecture of the post and lintel system, and the Parthenon actually became the prototype for all classical buildings. You see very balanced, that you show balance through symmetry, clean, simple lines, and the characteristics of classical architecture: convention, order, balance, idealization, simplicity, and grace through restrained vitality. What's interesting about this work, though, it's actually an optical illusion. There really aren't any straight lines in the Parthenon because the Greeks understood how the human eye works. So the columns actually kind of bow out in the middle. That way, from a distance, they appear straight. Same thing with the horizontal lines. If you were standing at one end of the building and somebody else was standing at the other, and you set a book down on the ground, you would not be able to see it from the other side. Why? Because again, the line is actually curved. Yet they create it this way on purpose so when it's viewed by the human eye, it appears straight. Also important from the Parthenon is the friezes. These are the relief sculptures that were around the upper edges of the Parthenon on the outside. And what makes this so interesting is that on these friezes was what's called the Parthenon procession. In the pediment, meaning the triangle area in the front, which you can see on the lower right image here, you had all of the gods depicted. But on the rest of the frieze, following around the entire building, this was actually showing the citizens of Athens. What makes this so interesting is that this actually puts the citizens of Athens almost on the same level of the gods, showing the changing role that maybe the Greeks weren't looking to the gods so much as religious figures anymore, but something even equal to themselves. The other images I have here on the left, this is a replica of Athena, the 40-foot golden statue, ivory and gold statue that was inside the temple. This and the lower right-hand image are actually taken from the Parthenon that's in Nashville, Tennessee. If you ever get the chance to go to Nashville, go look at it. They have a life-size replica of the Parthenon. All right, well, now moving on to the Middle Ages. The Middle Ages was a time that was dominated by the church. In fact, the term Middle Ages or the Dark Ages actually came from the people in the Renaissance, because they believed the Middle Ages was a time where nothing important really happened. Again, the church controlled almost all aspects of life. However, we still see a lot of these Greek and Roman myths influencing many of the artworks. What would often happen, though, is that medieval artists would employ these ancient motifs in their pre Christian connotations. And what they would do is they would take some of these classical figures, but they would put them in more modern clothing of the time, so they were more relatable. Very interesting enough, Dionysus, the god of wine, was a very popular example in art throughout the Middle Ages, even after Christianity eclipsed his cult. And here, what we're going to see, what you're looking at, this is a French ornamental box or casket. It's not a casket as we think of the term. This is actually smaller. It's a jewelry box, most likely. This is about circa 310 to 330. It was made in Paris, France, and it's made out of elephant ivory. Now, this would most likely be the property of a wealthier woman at the time. And what's interesting is we're looking on these front panels here. We see 4 different panels. The decoration in the panel on the left shows Aristotle, one of the greatest philosophers of the ancient Greek world, and he's sitting with his pupil, the young Prince Alexander the Great. In the next scene, we see Alexander's watching from the wall. You can see him up near the top. And what's happening is that Aristotle is on all fours, carrying Alexander's mistress, Phyllis, on his back. And according to this story, Phyllis used to use this as a means to humiliate Aristotle, and Aristotle in turn made it a lesson for Alexander, saying that if a woman could overcome so wise and prudent an old man, how much more so does a young man have to fear from her? And then the other 2 panels actually retell a story from Ovid. And this is the romance of Pyramus and Thisbe. And what we see on the 3rd panel is, well, the story between them. This is from Ovid's Metamorphosis. But Pyramus and Thisbe were a young couple. And they lived in the city of Babylon. And their houses were connected by, but there was a large wall. And they loved each other. But their parents forbid them to wed because their parents had a rivalry between them. Well, what they would do is they would talk to each other through a crack in one of the walls. And you can actually see that in the 4th panel. You see them both kind of leaning over and looking through the wall. And this is how they would talk to each other. Well, what they decided is that they would run away and then they would get married on their own. So they arranged to meet under a mulberry tree and state their true feelings for one another. Well, what happens is Thisbe arrives first, but when she gets there, there's actually a lioness with her mouth all bloody from a recent kill. And that's what you can see in the 3rd panel. You can see the lion. Well, Thisbe sees the lioness and is frightened, so she runs away. Well, when she runs away, she drops her veil. Well, then Pyramus arrives, and he's horrified at the sight. Why? Because remember, the lioness is there with her bloody mouth. Well, she has actually picked up Thisbe's veil, and so she has the veil in her mouth. So Pyramus thinks that the wild beast has actually killed Thisbe. So what does he do? He kills himself by falling on his sword. And then as this happens, his blood actually splashes onto the mulberry leaves in the fruit. They had been white, and it changed the fruit to this dark red, where we know as mulberries are today. So he's lying dead. Thisbe returns, eager to tell him about her adventure, but she comes and she finds his dead body. So what does she do after mourning him? Of course, she stabs herself with the same sword. So in the end, the gods actually listen to Thisbe lament her lost love. And so to honor both of them and their forbidden love, they decide to leave the berries of the mulberry tree or the mulberry bush that deep dark red color, which again comes from Pyramus's blood. But we see this ancient tale again on the medieval art piece. Interestingly enough, this same tale shows up in Shakespeare's A Midsummer Night's Dream. This is actually the play within the play. All right, well, then moving on to the early Renaissance. In the Renaissance, it's the time of rebirth, but a rebirth of what? Of classical, ancient Greek and Roman ideals. Again, we're moving a little bit further away from the church at this time. During the Renaissance, we're going to have the Protestant Reformation, where we're going to see the split within the church. Yet, even the church itself has a large artistic campaign going on trying to bring people back into the church. But here we see in Sandro Botticelli's This is the Birth of Venus, circa 1486. It's a tempera on canvas. And what we're seeing depicted here is it's supposed to be the moment of Venus's birth. Venus is supposedly formed from the foam in the sea, and she comes to shore on the shell, a fully formed woman. And that's what Botticelli is showing here. So again, he is showing the scene as the myth tells it. However, Botticelli was also using this as an allegory, meaning it stood for something else. And so with this work, there's actually a religious connotation behind it. Some scholars claim that Venus is actually likened to Mary because this pureness and the purity of the female. We're going to see this influence continue into the High Renaissance. This sculpture is Apollo and Daphne by Bernini, 1622 to 25, and it is a marble. And again, this is based off of an ancient myth. So what happens in this story is Apollo, one of the most powerful gods, we remember him from the Iliad, he's a powerful god and he's a great warrior. Well, he mocks the god of love, Cupid, for using a bow and arrow. Basically, he says to them, like, oh, what are you doing with these powerful weapons, you naughty little boy? Well, this obviously insults Cupid. And so what does he do? He prepares 2 arrows. One is gold and one is lead. He shoots Apollo with the gold arrow, meaning that the next person he sees, he's going to fall madly in love with. So he actually sees the nymph Daphne next. So he falls madly in love with her, becomes obsessed with her. So then Cupid shoots Daphne with the lead arrow, which makes her despise Apollo. She wants nothing to do with him. In fact, Daphne follows Apollo's twin sister, Artemis, or Diana. She is the virgin god, and she had spurned many lovers, and Daphne follows her cult, and so she wants nothing to do with men. So she is running away from Apollo, and Apollo continually follows her, begging her to stay, but she runs and she runs and she runs. Well, eventually, Cupid intervenes, and he tries to help Apollo catch Daphne. Well, Daphne's father was the river god Peneus, and what happens is she asks him for help. And she calls out, help me, Father, open the earth to enclose me or change my form, which has brought me into this danger. Let me be free of this man from this moment forward. And with this, her father answers her plea. And the line from the original myth says, a heavy numbness seizes her limbs. Her soft breasts are surrounded by a thin bark. Her hair changes into foliage. Her forearms change into branches. Her foot, just swift now clings because of sluggish roots. And what happens is she turns into a laurel tree. And this is that moment we're seeing. So in this image, look down at the bottom. Her feet and her legs almost are forming a trunk. And then you can clearly see it in these 2 images, that her hair is becoming twisted and vine-like, and her fingers have branched off into different leaves. And so this is that moment that is captured here. Interesting enough, how the tale goes is that despite Daphne's rejection, Apollo is still in love with her, and he vows to love her forever. And so he says, always my hair will have you, my lyres will have you, my quivers will have you, laurel tree. You will be present to 2 Latin places. With a happy voice will sing a triumph, and they will visit the great ceremonies at the Capitolian Hill, meaning the Olympics. Remember, in many of the Olympic Games, the winners are crowned with a wreath of laurel leaves, and that is from this myth. Also, Apollo used his powers of eternal youth and immortality to render Daphne evergreen. And the explanation is this is the reason why the leaves of the bay laurel tree never decay. Right, then moving on to another time period, the neoclassical time period. Here we're looking at the 18th century. Again, this is a return to classical ideas, and we can see that in the work pictured here. This is another sculpture. This is Psyche Revived by Cupid's Kiss by Antonio Canova, 1787 to 1793. And this is based again off of another ancient myth. What's portrayed here is Psyche, who is the female. She had two sisters, and they were all considered, they were very, very beautiful. And in fact, that they were so beautiful that people almost began to worship them for their beauty. Well, of course, this makes Venus, the goddess of beauty, very angry. She's not happy with this. So she orders the daughters to be married off. Well, two of them are married, but Psyche is not. She's the youngest and the most beautiful of them, and nobody will marry her. So what happens is Venus is just jealous. She's infuriated that people still seem to be worshiping her. And what she does is she orders her son Cupid to avenge her by making Psyche enamored of the lowest of all human beings. That she is going to have to become married to this beast-like creature. Supposedly her fate is to be horrible. Well, what happens is basically her family sends her off to, because you can't deny the god, to marry this creature, and the Zephyr, the west wind, comes and takes her away. But where he takes her away to is kind of this magical place. It's this marble palace. It's covered with precious stones, and everything she wants is instantly given to her. I think there's all these magical servants who take care of her. This is almost your, Beauty and the Beast, be our guest scene. Well, each night a mysterious visitor comes to her room and makes love to her. This is her husband, but he forbids her to ever try to see her face. Well, Psyche, this continues on and she's quite happy, but then she starts to get a little lonely. So her husband, sensing this, allows her sisters to come for a visit. Well, remember, the rest of the family thinks Psyche's living this horrible life. The sisters see that she's living in this wonderful palace and that she's happy, and they become jealous. So they start to warn her, saying, remember what the prophecy said, that you're actually married to a horrible, horrible beast, and he's going to kill you. He's just letting you think everything's fine, but one day he's going to kill you. So you need to kill him first. And because of this, doubt starts to creep into Psyche's mind. So one night, as when her husband comes to her after he lays sleeping, what she does is that she lights the oil lamp because she wants to see her husband. Well, what she finds astounds her. Her husband is actually Cupid. Cupid, when he had first saw Psyche, fell in love with her. And so he did not doom her to love a beast as his mother wanted, but he himself is actually Psyche's husband. Well, Psyche is so shocked by this and so just enamored of his beauty that she drops some oil on him. And it wakes him, and he's hurt, and his mother comes and swoops him away and takes him away. Well, desperate, Psyche wants to get back to Cupid. She also loves him. But Venus is angry because Psyche has physically and emotionally hurt her son. So what she does is she gives her these different ordeals or these tasks to do before she'll let her see Cupid. So the first of these tasks is she puts her in this room full of grain and tells her that she has to separate all the grains out into their individual piles by morning, or basically she'll die. Well, she starts doing this, and then she realizes it's an impossible task, and she begins to cry. Well, all the little bugs and the animals hear this, and they feel bad for Psyche, so they actually go and separate all the grains out. So when Venus comes back in the morning, the task is complete. She's not happy. So then she gives her another task and says, okay, I want you to go and get the fleece from this specific ram. And she said, okay. So Psyche goes to the field where the ram is, and she's about to approach it to cut the fleece. But all of a sudden, a shepherd stops her and says, no, what are you doing? This ram is very violent. If you would try to do this, he would actually kill you. And so the shepherd goes, and he gets the fleece for her and gives it to her. She takes it back to Venus. Again, Venus not happy. So Venus is like, all right, I have one final task. And what I want you to do is you need to go down to the underworld because they have a flask there for me. And inside it, it's something that helps make me even more beautiful. So I want you to go get it, but make sure you don't open it. So Psyche says, okay. And she goes, she's trying to figure out how do you get to the underworld. Well, to get to the underworld, you have to be dead. So Psyche's almost about ready to throw herself off a cliff so she'll die and go to the underworld. When somebody stops her and says, no, 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 you don't have to kill yourself. You can actually go to the entrance of the underworld, pay Charon, and he will take you across the river Styx and back once. And so she does this. She gets the vessel. And she's returning, she's back in the world, and she's returning it to Venus. Well, what happens every time we're given something we're told not to look in? We look in it. So Psyche thinks, well, if this is going to make Venus even more beautiful, I'm about to see Cupid and I want to appear even more beautiful for him. And so she opens the flask, poisonous vapors come up, and she falls into a death-like sleep. So what happens then is Cupid learns of what his mother's done and learns of these tasks, and he escapes from his mother. And so what we see here is the moment where he finds her laying on the ground. And of course, what's the one thing that will revive her from the death-like sleep is true love's kiss. So this is that moment that Canova has chosen to portray. This is where Cupid has picked Psyche up for the ground and kissed her, and she's now coming back to life. And we can see this kiss, that moment, is the focal of the work. The lines of the wings draw our eye to that moment. Psyche's arms literally encircle the focal point. But again, this is why it is shown within the work. And then, interesting enough, if you look on the back here, on the right picture, on the bottom left by Psyche's leg, you can actually see the flask. That's what she had in her possession to bring back to Venus. And then what eventually happens is, moved by such devotion between Psyche and Cupid, the gods finally grant Cupid Psyche's hand, says, yes, you can marry her. They end up giving her nectar and ambrosia, and this also makes her immortal. And then they consecrated her the goddess of the soul. And since ancient times, Psyche has always been depicted with butterfly wings. Why? This is a reference to the dual meaning of her name, the Psyche in Greek, which means soul and butterfly. And then this is also why the butterfly has become a symbol for the immortality of the soul. The story of Psyche is supposed to symbolize the ordeals that the soul must undergo in order to achieve happiness and immortality. All right, and now we're going to look at another piece. This one is interesting. This one is titled Enthroned Washington, and it's by Horatio Granat, 1832, and it's a marble. Now, this is a sculpture of George Washington, father of our country. And when you look at it, who is it supposed to look like? Who does it remind you of? Well, what happens is the United States Congress commissioned Granat to create a statue of Washington for display in the U.S. Capitol Rotunda. However, when the marble arrived in Washington in 1841, it immediately generated controversy and criticism. Many people found the sight of a half-naked Washington offensive or even comical. And you can see what he's trying to do in this work, though, is he's trying to make Washington look like Zeus, right? Zeus, father and ruler of the gods. He was trying to liken Washington, the father and first ruler of the country, to this level of immortality. The statue was actually eventually relocated to the East Lawn of the Capitol in 1843, but people still didn't like it. Some people would say the outstretched arm was Washington actually searching for his clothes. In 1908, the statue was brought back indoors when Congress transferred it to the Smithsonian Castle, and it remained there until 1964. Then it was moved to the Museum of History and Technology, which is now named the National Museum of American History, and that's where you can still see it today. Funny enough, it's exhibited, but it's on the second floor of the museum, kind of tucked away. But again, the idea, right, this is influenced by that idea of Zeus, right, the all-powerful king of the gods, father of the gods. Washington is supposed to be likened as the father of the country. And then finally, we're going to look at a modern work here. This is by Romain Brereton, and this is from Homer's book, or epic poem, The Odyssey. The Odyssey, remember, is almost the second part of the Iliad. What happens in the Odyssey is we learn of Odysseus' 10-year journey to get home to his wife Penelope. This is called The Return of Odysseus, 1977. And it's a collage comprised of cut and pasted papers, graphite, and touches of brush with black and gray wash. And this is all on wood panel. Well, what happens with this? This is an adaptation because he does, through a series of work, Brereton tells the story of Odysseus. This scene here, this is the moment where Odysseus returns home. And what had happened was his wife Penelope was waiting for him. Remember, he's been gone 10 years in the Trojan War, and then it's taking him 10 years to get back. And there's all of this, people are like, no, Penelope, she has many suitors, and they want her to marry and have a new king. Well, she doesn't want to. She's still holding out hope that Odysseus will return. And so what she does is she tells them all, well, I'm weaving this mantle for my father-in-law. And when I'm done with this, then I'll finally pick a new husband. And so that's where we see Penelope on the left, that she's sitting at her loom. Well, what she does is she weaves all day, then at night she actually undoes what she's woven. Well, the suitors catch on to this, and they say, no, you're going to have to choose somebody. Well, Odysseus returns, and what he proposes is to get all these, basically to make all the suitors go away, is that they should hold a series of games. And the person who wins the game is the one who will win Penelope's hand. And so what happens is, this is the moment where he's coming back, and he tells his son realizes that Odysseus is back, tells his son, have your mother do this. And so he convinces the mother to do this. And what happens is, the task is that you have to shoot an arrow through 12 axe rings, very, very small. Well, what happens is Odysseus comes and dressed in disguise, and he competes with all the other suitors. Well, he, of course, is the only one who can do this. He does it, he's successful, and then what happens is that he reveals that it's him, it's Odysseus, he's the true king, he's back, he kills all the suitor, and he and Penelope are reunited. And that's what we see depicted here. This is Penelope at her loom, the young son telling her, you should do this, and the ship in the window that we can see in the water, that's Odysseus actually returning. And so what's interesting here is Brereton is an African-American artist. And what he would like to do is he would take these ancient tales and he would change it so the characters were actually represented as African-Americans, giving a different connection to this very historical tale. And so with this, we can see, this is definitely an adaptation, that he has changed the race of the characters, but he's done so in a way that it tells the story in almost a new way. It makes new connections with the original myth. But through this lecture, you can see just from these few pieces how large of a role mythology has played in inspiring and influencing artworks. And that's what you are then going to do in your assignment for this week.